Welcome friends to another r/malicious compliance video. If you'd like to hear really crafty stories of compliance, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons down below. That said, our first story of the day is by NerdFury83. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Goes both ways. My new manager at work is one of those people that absolutely has to be in control. Even when you're exceeding every scorecard measure, keeping your head down, not putting a toe out of line, she still asks you to come to a meeting room to discuss some minor issue or another. Recently, she pulled me into a meeting to discuss me being late from work. Protocol is to call in, say we'll be late, then submit a schedule adjustment request when we arrived. She accused me of not calling in or submitting a request, but was able to prove I did. Only, instead of leaving it at that, she insisted I now needed to call her and explain why I was late. That's not the process, I told her, and she said she was making a new one. So now I call her at 6 a.m. on her day off to let her know if I'm gonna be late. She also had a meeting with me because my scorecard for a stat was 99 out of 100, with a target of 50. She had to point out the 1 out of 100 I missed. She also did the same for a handling time issue where I'm hitting an average of 600 seconds, with a target of 1500. She needed to tell me about a call I took too long on. Suffice to say, complaints have been raised to her manager, following an incident where she asked to follow up on something for me and claimed if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. I've been asking for everything in writing and repeat that mantra back to her when she claims to have told me something. Last week, she asked me to see her after my call. I walked over and she wasn't there, so I went back to my desk. She asked me why I didn't stay around, and I reminded her of the time she put in writing that I wasn't to spend more than 1 minute waiting for her if she asked to see me, and was to go back to my desk to take calls, not wasting time. She asked me to come over again, and when I did, she wasn't there. This repeated twice more before my shift was over. Each time I documented, logged out at such and such time, came to your desk, you were not there, spent 45 seconds waiting, returned to desk and took another call 2 minutes later. In the chat, she messages me to ask what time I finish. I tell her it was 2 minutes prior, and she says we can catch up now. I tell her that my shift is over and ask if she'll approve an overtime pay for an out-of-hours meeting. She tells me not to be silly and it'll just take 10 minutes. I refuse and say if I don't get paid, we can do it tomorrow when I'm being paid. She's typing, then not, then typing, then not, choosing her words. I know she's angry at being challenged and she decided to employ one of the tactics she used when she managed a team for a company where this was standard practice. Okay, well, if you'd like to go home now, I can always make it a formal meeting. A formal meeting where I work is a code for meeting with HR, documented on your record, for misconduct and repeated issues. She thinks she's won. I say, not a problem, make a formal meeting. Ensure I have 24 hours notice, send a formal invite, and I'll bring a support person with me. I log out and leave, but not before grabbing screenshots and saving a copy of the chat logs. Next day, she's called my bluff and has a meeting scheduled. I send it to my union rep, and she comes in on the day. HR sits down with us and opens with, "So we're here today to discuss some concerns. Your team leader asked you to attend an off-the-cuff catch-up 3 times, and for some reason you refused?" I quickly clarify what actually happened. My manager claims otherwise, and I repeat her mantra, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Then I supply receipts, her demands to put things in writing, her chat, my timestamps, my call logs, and her message to me afterwards. My union rep stares at the two of them with a small smile and asks, "So, do you maintain the position that employees should attend meetings unpaid and that misconduct investigations are a good use of resources if they refuse?" HR said there may have been a miscommunication and that I could return to work. I've put it in writing that I'm not accused of any misconduct and have been cleared of any false accusations, with nothing documented on my staff file. Yesterday, my team was advised that our team leader had decided to pursue opportunities outside of the company, and we were getting a new manager. Let me ask you guys, if you had a manager that you were working for like this, would you go out of your way to keep receipts, emails, words, conversations, everything you can to cover your butt? Or is it just too much work and you shouldn't have to work like that in any environment? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Our next story is by Rowan Never. "You keep having my time estimates? You're right, my estimates should be more reliable. A couple of decades ago, I was working as the only technical writer in a fairly large team of developers. Our manager was Cambridge educated, liked to cut estimates, and was particularly convinced that my job was easy and quick. and that I was lazy and terrible at estimates. He'd point out that the worst typist could type a page of text in an hour, so I should be getting through at least 8 pages of user manual a day. When he halved my time estimates and gave me the new deadlines, I, like the doofus I was, slaved away, working unpaid overtime and squeaked on over the line, and then usually ended up taking a couple of days sick leave to recover. That eventually got me called into HR for being unreliable. Something in me snapped at that point. The next project, the same scenario played out. I gave my quite good time estimates. He poo-pooed them and halved them. I shrugged and accepted his pronouncement. He pointed out that I really needed to get better at estimating my time. Malicious compliance time. 2 weeks before the end of the 2-month project, he asked for an update. I say, "Oh, I'm a bit over a third of the way through the documentation," I said calmly, as though there wasn't a deadline staring me in the face. He blinked and asked for an explanation. I say, "Well, I told you it would take 4 months to do the amount of documentation you asked for, and it looks as though if I don't do any overtime, it's actually pretty close to correct based on my progress so far." I beamed at him as though I was completely unaware that he had managers and a CTO who were expecting my documentation based on the information he gave them, along with the product it's describing, of course. Much to my surprise, it didn't even seem to occur to him to yell at me. The sheer confidence with which I delivered the devastating news had utterly confused him. He ended up helping me to cut down the requirements and then finish completing the documentation to meet the deadline. I worked my usual hours, and if he asked me to do overtime, played dumb and said, "No, sorry, I get sick if I do that, so I don't anymore." He worked a lot of overtime. I would walk past his office to see him staring at his computer monitor, biting his fingernails, and looking very, very worried. He wrote a lot of substandard documentation, and being a perfectionist, that really upset him. He didn't see his family much for 2 weeks. I spent a lot of my time at work trying not to cackle like a warlock who's had one too many pep pills. Once he had some time to recover, he called me into his office to discuss new ways of estimating time for documentation, and carefully suggested that maybe half a page to a page of documentation a day was a fair general estimate, maybe, and perhaps at some point we should look at hiring a second tech writer. Now, I don't blame the manager for trying to get the most out of the people who work for them. I do blame them for allowing the workers to work unhealthily to the point where they would get sick and have to take time off. But it also does seem like OP said, as soon as they had a backbone, the manager's bluff was just totally called. So really I wonder how much of it was a facade. This next story is by The Pettiest. Lunch break is 60 minutes. I was working 50+ hours weekly for a huge corporate bank on salary. My apartment was 1 mile to my office, and both had rental bike stations I used regularly. My boss at the time was a time cruncher and regularly disregarded the overtime I was working to point out a few minutes here and there. One day I went home for lunch, walked my dog, got on my bike, and within 30 seconds was hit by a car. EMTs were called to the scene, but nothing was broken. Clothes were ripped and I had road rash and blood. Called my boss to let her know I'd be back a little late due to the crash, and she told me that lunch would be 60 minutes only, and I would face repercussions if late. So I didn't go home and change. I went right back to work where the head of the department immediately called me in, seeing my ripped and bloody attire, explained what happened, and told them I would not take more than 60 minutes ever again, regardless of circumstances. My boss was pleased, but I was sent home to change. A few weeks later, they asked me why I stopped working 50-hour weeks. Well, if lunch is only 60 minutes, then work is only 8 hours, and I haven't worked overtime since. Definitely, if there's a job out there that's going to nickel and dime you like that, you don't deserve to give them overtime. You don't deserve to break your back. You literally got hit by a car and they complained. You owe nothing to that company. Our next story is by Ginger Penguin. You must report any suspicious emails to us right away, and we will regularly test you to make sure you do it. Wait, not like that. For context, my company takes phishing attempts in cybersecurity fairly seriously. We get some training on this and are told you can't be too careful with emails. As part of that, we regularly, at least once a month, receive a fake email asking us to log in or open a file, provide info, etc. If we open or follow a link, our managers are informed, and to do it regularly, you'll get disciplined or sacked. Fast forward to today, and we're all getting our yearly bonus. For whatever reason, rather than include it in our next pay packet, they sent it differently and emailed us all remittance advice. Not only were we not expecting this, a red flag for a suspicious email, it wasn't from the account's usual email address. Unknown address, also a red flag, and the attached document had a garbled name. You guessed it, another red flag. An hour later, we get a generic email thanking us all for our vigilance and telling us to please stop reporting that email as it is valid and not a threat, and they've been overwhelmed with the volume of reports. Turns out, it's possible to be too paranoid. Well, you reported that email and then got another email saying, no, this is very legit, you better open it. How am I supposed to know that you're being truthful? I feel like that's what the fishers would want us to think. And in general, I definitely understand employment places that do these kinds of exercises. It's good to stay vigilant and be aware of what is or isn't a phishing scam. That said, it always feels like a very weird case of entrapment. Like, the company's basically trying as hard as they can to fool you so that they can discipline you or let you go. It's just kind of a weird dynamic. I would understand doing it and just giving a heads up or a warning every time people fall for it, but feels wrong for disciplinary action or getting fired altogether. And our final story of the day is by Sausage Mahoney. 3 independent appraisals aren't good enough? Fine, we'll go with yours. When my parents decided to call it quits, my dad did his best to make the whole process as painful and messy as possible, feeding us lies and vitriol, hiding money and assets, and demanding things that he only wanted because he knew it would inconvenience my mother, such as demanding the big car after conceding full custody early on, leaving her with a Matchbox car. When it came to the house, my mother had done the figures and realized that if she sold the house and split the money, she'd never be in a position to move up in the housing market again. Somewhat prescient now that I think about it. So, her plan was to take out a mortgage on the house to the value of Dad's share and buy him out. As she had paid most of the thing off and had all the documentation in the world to prove it, the judge decided to split it 75-25 in her favor. To ensure that everything was fair and equitable, Mom hired 3 independent valuers to come in and value the house and land. The figures she got back ranged from $400 to $420. She went back to the judge with them and was prepared to go with the average. Dad objected, insisting that the house was worth much more. He demanded that his estate agent be allowed to do a valuation and that they go with his figure. Mom, having had a gutful at this stage and wanting more than anything for it to be over, agreed. The judge set a date for the next hearing and made it clear that whatever Dad's valuer came back with was the final figure. The valuer came back around a couple of days later, did his thing, and sent off the appraisal to both my parents. The final valuation that the judge went with? $360. I think the thing I adore the most in this story is that OP's mom went out of their way to do things completely fairly and completely right. And although they did everything by the book and everything as fairly as they could just to get it over with, the father didn't agree, thought they were being greedy, and they get stuck with thousands less. That's also not to mention just the outright despicable behavior. I just couldn't imagine being a father of a kid or multiple kids maybe, and not only intentionally making it hard for the mother of the children to just get by on a day-to-day life, but also it affects the kids too. I think it just really tells you all you really need to know about this father, let alone the fact that at the very end, that greed really wore heavy and lost them thousands. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. So of all these stories I've read today, which is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you haven't yet, if you could like and subscribe, that would mean a lot to me. Whatever you do, whether it's liking, subscribing, turning notifications on, all of it helps grow this channel and I appreciate the heck out of it. So until next time, I'll see you all tomorrow with some more stories.